During the last decade, we saw a proliferation of time-of-flight cameras in the market, and in this paper, we propose a physics-based, unbiased, ellipsoidal connections-based, time-gated rendering. Here we show time-of-flight rendering for gated camera, pulse time-of-flight cameras, and continuous wave time-of-flight cameras. In this paper, we focus on time-gated rendering. The radiance measured by a time-of-flight camera is given by this path space integral, where x bar is a path, f of x bar is the total radiance flowing through the path, mod x bar is the total path length, and wt is the path length weighing function. Different time-of-flight cameras such as gated, transient, and continuous wave time-of-flight cameras differ by path length weighing function wt. To render a time-of-flight camera, we have to evaluate this integral. We can use Monte Carlo path integration techniques to solve the integral. For example, we can use bidirectional path tracing to generate the paths and weigh them with Wt of mod x bar before aggregating. This is the physics-based rendering approach proposed by Charabo et al. However, such a technique has no control over path lengths generated, and if Wt is 0 almost everywhere, vast majority of paths generated contribute 0 radians, leading to higher variance in the estimate. What we really need to do is first sample a desired path length value by importance sampling Wt, and then sample a path that maximizes the radiance but is constrained to have total path length mod x bar. Our key contribution is coming up with a way to path sample with a path length constraint. Let us go back to BDPT path sampling technique. We have source subpath and sensor subpath, and we are joining them directly. We propose that we don't join them directly, but instead join them with a connecting vertex such that the total path length satisfies the path length constraint. For a given source and sensor subpaths and path length constraint, this vertex must lie on an ellipsoid formed by x's and xc as focal points to satisfy the path length constraint. As this ellipsoidal vertex must also lie on the scene, we intersect the scene with ellipsoid to locate these vertices. We propose ellipsoid triangle intersection algorithm and several accelerations to determine the locations of the ellipsoidal connections. We derived an analytical measure to compute the probability of making an ellipsoidal connection. Please refer to the paper and supplementary material for the details. We characterize the rendering performance as a function of gate width for fixed rendering time. As the gate width increases, the advantage of sampling with path length constraint is lost. This is due to the fact that almost all the paths rendered with direct connections fall within the rendered gate width. Here we characterize the rendering performance as a function of scene complexity. We tessellate the bunny in the scene to artificially increase the number of triangles without changing the geometry. These results are for 12.5 picosecond gate width, and we observe that the ellipsoidal connections have less variance than direct connections for up to 44,000 triangles. Here we characterize the rendering performance as a function of BRDF. The BRDF of the boxes in the scene are progressively made specular. We can observe that the performance of both direct and ellipsoidal connections become worse as the scene becomes more specular. However, ellipsoidal connections become much more worse than direct connections as ellipsoidal connections add two edges directly. Transient cameras such as ICCDs or car gates record transient by imaging one gated image at a time. Typical scanning time for each gate is around 50 milliseconds. Hence, to render transients for dynamic scenes, we have to render one gate at a time. Here we show that transients rendered with ellipsoidal connections have less variance compared to direct connections. Fixed time gate cameras are also used in automobiles to image photons coming from particular time range of interest. For this road scene, we can observe that ellipsoidal connections are effective compared to direct connections in rendering automobile gated cameras. Narrow time gated cameras can be used to enhance images captured through partial occluders such as fences or fog. We create a zoo scene with a giraffe inside a fence and a photographer outside the fence. Lens-based steady-state camera would produce a blurry image as shown in the second image. In the last two figures, we observe that rendering with ellipsoidal connections is beneficial compared to rendering with direct connections. Ellipsoidal connections can also be used to simulate correlation-based hemofluid cameras. We show a case when depth-selective correlation codes proposed by Tadano et al. Are employed. In this case, ellipsoidal connections have much less variance than BDPT for a fixed rendering time. We simulate the imaging system proposed by Anonymous et al. The full scene is shown in the left, with time-gated cameras on one side of the barrier and three objects on the other side. The temporal focusing camera scans one hidden voxel at a time. We render these per voxel measurements using direct connections and ellipsoidal connections for a time gate of 2 picoseconds. Ellipsoidal connections far outweigh direct connections in rendering temporal focusing camera. To summarize, we proposed ellipsoidal connections for gated rendering and developed data structures and pruning algorithms for efficiently making ellipsoidal connections. We characterize the effect of gate width, scene complexity, and BRDF on the gains given by ellipsoidal rendering. We showed contemporary time-gated rendering examples where ellipsoidal connections converge faster than direct connections.